Hello, everyone, and welcome to my special interview with Magdalene Moonsamy, during which we'll discuss and unpack the key issues surrounding the May 29 general elections in South Africa. In many ways, this conversation will set the scene for our upcoming Twitter space via the Resistance Bureau happening on Tuesday, May 28. I thought Maggie would be perfect for this because she tells it straight and always speaks truth to power. Her biography is long and impressive, but for the relevance of today's show, I will mention that she is an official observer with South Africa's Independent Electoral Commission. She is also a former member of parliament, and in her spare time, if you can call it that, she is a human rights activist and lawyer, as well as a special advisor to South Africa's Minister of Defense and military veterans. Thank you so much for joining me today, Maggie. I know this is a hectic time,
Thank you.
so I really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts. Shall we dive right in?
Yes, let's go for it.
All right. Well, my first question for you is I wanted you to tell us and our viewers about the pre-election environment in your assessment of the preparedness of the Election Commission to hold a free and fair election. I ask this because I was recently looking at an Afrobarometer survey, and it indicated that only 28% of South Africans express a high level of trust in the IEC, which to me was rather shocking. And this percentage is well below the regional average. So, what is your confidence level in the IEC's capacity to successfully pull off a credible election next week?
Thank you, Jeff. I think if we're speaking from a historical perspective, since 94, we'll understand that the transition into democracy was one that demonstrated itself at the polls, where you had people standing, and I'm sure you have visuals of that period and that era. And ever since then, we've made it a point of ensuring the independence of the IEC, one, and that the IEC is able to gain the kind of confidence of the nation, insofar as there being hotlines, there being systems in place for any kind of report that must be done. Polls is not something that I generally trust because it has shown us also in previous elections that polls do not reflect truly what it is. And remember, we've got 28 million voters, over almost 60 million South Africans, and we have to look at the demographics. So, who are those? Who are those 28% that don't have confidence in the IEC? It's a natural process, and I'm sure that even in the United States elections, you will find people who are not having confidence in the system because they want their candidate to win. And it is a democracy. And there's rhetoric, and there's a lot of things that go with it. But with the IEC, the process is very, very secure. There are seals. As an observer, we check the seals in comparison to what is on. We ensure that there is a safe means of transportation of the ballots to the designated venues for counting. We've already had special votes on the 16th of May, during which time people came out wherever they are that could not vote on the 29th. We've had no complaints in regard to the IEC in that regard because there was a lot of voter education going on with the registration, and there was special registration and a second round of registration for voters. So I believe that in terms of a free and fair election, to this point, we have not been accused as a country, like others have, of having rigged or done anything negative in an election. So we ensure that there is multi-party involvement. So it cannot be that there are stakeholders that are excluded from the process. There are observers that come from all civil society, the APRM, which is the African Peer Review Mechanism, of which I'm the deputy chair, and we ensure that we pull in as many observers to ensure there's no difficulties, challenges, etc. at the polls. And so far, I think anything that is contested can be contested in a court if there is reason. So the due process that we have in the country gives that kind of confidence to people to be able to say, okay, if you feel that this IEC, this election is going to, and remember, it's a highly contested election. So it's one of our most highly contested elections. And we've had to go through many processes in terms of parties that have been formed and looking at what are the implications of those that have not been able to qualify. And the courts are in support and in line with the accountability, the freeness, the fairness, and the credibility of the election. So it's not a simple matter of the Independent Electoral Commission having its own way. There is still the avenue that is available should there be any contestation that is, or any disgruntlement that can then be raised in a court, in the courts.
That is super, super helpful context. And I really think it speaks to the evolution of not only South African democracy, but worldwide. It's a reminder that we're all evolving. You know, democracy is not a stagnant process, but it's always, always a work in progress. And your point about the strength of the judiciary, I think, is so important because I think that's a really critical element here that many people perhaps lose sight of. But on that topic of the evolution of South African democracy in particular, I wanted to ask you about another issue that is super interesting to me because today more than half of South Africa's population was actually born after 1994, the first democratic elections in the country, of course. And since then, as we all know, Nelson Mandela's African National Congress has ruled the country. It has dominated the legislature and national politics, even the national psyche in many respects. But for many of these younger voters, it seems to me that the ANC's fight for liberation is old history. And for many, the daily reality is the spread of corruption, economic stagnation, lack of access to basic services. These are the main criticisms that have routinely come up. So I wanted to ask you, what is your thought on these sentiments and how have they shaped the campaign period and possible voting preferences on May 29?
Well, I think for one, 30 years of democracy, after having come out of a very, very apartheid state which separated people according to race, people not having access to basic housing, a lot of informal settlements, homelessness, etc., is a global issue. However, what the country has become in terms of its role in the continent and the world, it has become a game changer. We all are experiencing a global economic crisis. We appreciate and understand that. The sentiments of young people is the expectation of finding themselves within the economic mainstream, getting free education, and getting employed. The challenge that we have is not that it is an isolation or a deliberate effect on young people who we classify between the ages of 14 and 35. Remember that that becomes an issue as well. But the demographic of young people must also be considered in respect of young women. So when you consider those aspects, one would then have to consider, okay, what are these thoughts, these sentiments that have now made people feel this way? Remember, Jeff, in the past, a non-white person had no voice. And now democracy has given the population a voice. So you are going to hear more, and that was a minority-led, apartheid was led by a minority group. Now we are in a majority democracy that is functional, there's active participation, there's citizens with voices that are not being muzzled. So people are going to speak about things that affect them, and they can genuinely do so without fear or favor. So I believe that, yes, if we're looking at the role that we are playing in the continent, the ability that we have in terms of media, social media is another game changer in terms of where we've come from just a decade or so ago. The voices are louder, but the sentiment may sound greater because of doomsayers. However, this has given people now the opportunity to express themselves both on any platform, and there's no fear about it. So I think the confidence that I have in the anti-sentiment, if I can call it that, is that it's coming from a generation that does not understand the dynamics of where we have come from and the progress and development that we've made, our role in the continent, the guidance that we provide, and our role in global change.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. We've been obviously talking a lot about the domestic situation in South Africa, but you raised a really important point, and that is the role of, and in many ways, the mystique of South Africa in the international consciousness, the fight and the liberation battle against apartheid and white minority rule, and the inspiration um, the stories of inspiration that continue to be told to this day. And it's my sense, really, that the majority view of South Africa, certainly outside the country, on the continent and internationally, is that the country still represents one of the best democratic hopes on the continent, especially now, given the turmoil that we see ongoing in the Sahel, the ongoing wars in Ethiopia and Sudan and elsewhere. So I wanted to ask you specifically about that. So how do you and your colleagues and other South Africans navigate this seeming dual reality, balancing both the domestic and international expectations, which are very, very high and perhaps even unfair when you're looking at it from an international scope. So I wanted to ask you about that. And importantly, related to that, how do you see this election in particular shaping the country's future? So many are talking about it in regards to, this is a milestone election. This is such a critical election. This is the most interesting election since 1994. I know that's a lot, but I wanted you to give you the opportunity to unpack a bit of that for us, if you could.
I think for me, what is most important is that our role in the continent is a very, very significant role, especially while in the Sahel. You've got former President Thabo Mbeki, who was then negotiating at some point the separation of the South and the North of Sudan. And we see that the South is more peaceful, even though there are those some transgressions, etc. And the North is now having, and you've got Burkina Faso, you've got the situation in Egypt, etc. But the reality of the matter is that the interventionary role that is played by our international foreign diplomacy has become critical in trying to negotiate, even in those difficult terrains, to navigate the reasonableness and the ability to give guidance then on the continent, which is something that I think we've always done, and we continue to inspire. The right to self-determination, in whichever way or form it is brought about, must be that of the people themselves. And that is how we fought for our freedom and our liberation and our democracy. But in some instances where there needs to be caution exercised, I think that is where South Africa is able to step in and bring that caution to say, okay, this is the compromises that you might be making, and these are the consequences that may happen should you proceed in this matter. And I know that former President Thabo Mbeki was in Sudan negotiating again, and this is the role that we continue to play. We continue to play that role of not being instructive, but being rehabilitative in terms of neutralizing a conflict on the continent. Well, in that, in line with South Africa itself, I think one of the major achievements that we have been doing as an African Union, APRM, is country observation. So we have a peer review mechanism that says, okay, your change is unconstitutional, it's undemocratic, you need to exercise these rules. And that's where the peer review mechanism becomes so critical in places like Sierra Leone, etc., Senegal, and all of those things. And we are able to speak in an open APRM of all member states and be able to guide, give caution to say, um, you can't just expect us to accept that there is a constitutional change without demonstrating that constitutional change and the confidence of your people in that change.
Absolutely. I think you are spot on in that regard. And in many ways, I think South Africa as a nation continues to really defy all the odds every year. You know, you mentioned the doomsayers or the naysayers that seem to come around every election time, you know, with miserable dour forecasts, and the people always prove them wrong. And in that way, to your point, the country continues to inspire, and so do its citizens like you. So, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. It's always a real pleasure to catch up with you. I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. In the coming days, we will definitely keep our eyes on South Africa. And as I mentioned in our introduction, we are hosting a Twitter space via the Resistance Bureau at 6 p.m. South Africa time on Tuesday, May 28, election eve, with a really stellar panel of South Africans to further break all these issues down, talk about the election and its implications, both regional, international, and domestic. Of course, the show will feature Tessa Dooms, Kigotsi Chikane, William Gumede, and Fariel Hafaji, among others. So we hope to see you all then. Until next time, take good care. And Maggie, please keep up the great work, and we will definitely be watching
Thank you.
in touch.
And yourself, thank you for having me. Thank
Thank
you, Jeff.